Hello guys, have you ever stopped to think about where all those Christmas traditions you know come from? The lights, the decorated trees, the gift exchanges, the parties that last for days? Today, you're going to discover that long before Christmas existed, humanity was already celebrating winter in surprising and profound ways. Let's travel back to ancient Rome during Saturnalia and to the icy forests of northern Europe for the Yule festival. If you stick around until the end, you'll understand how these ancestral celebrations shaped the way we celebrate today. Before we start, subscribe to the channel to help our community grow and turn on the notification bell to get alerts for new stories. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's fascinating for us to know where our community is spread around the world. Now get comfortable, dim the lights, relax, and let's begin this journey through time. Imagine for a moment what it would be like to live in an era without electricity. No light bulb to flick on with a simple switch, no glowing screen to illuminate your face in the darkness. When the sun dipped below the horizon, especially during the winter months, night fell thick, deep, almost tangible. For ancient peoples, winter wasn't just a season, it was a test of survival, a time of uncertainty where the very continuity of life seemed threatened. On the shortest days of the year, when sunlight barely touched the earth for a few hours, an ancestral fear swept through communities. What if the sun didn't return? What if that growing darkness continued until it swallowed everything? It sounds irrational to us today, with our knowledge of astronomy and science, but put yourself in the place of someone living 2,000 years ago. You would watch the sun rising a little further south each day, growing weaker, lingering less time in the sky. Wouldn't it be natural to wonder if it simply vanished one day? It was in this context of vulnerability that the great winter celebrations were born. They weren't just parties, they were rituals of hope, collective acts of faith in the renewal of life. In Rome, at the height of its imperial power, when its legions dominated territories stretching from Britain to the Middle East, there was a celebration that completely transformed the social order for a few precious days. It was called Saturnalia, and it began on December 17th, initially lasting 3 days, then 5, and eventually a full week. Saturnalia was dedicated to Saturn, the god of agriculture and abundance, who, according to Roman mythology, had ruled during a golden age of prosperity and equality. During these special days, something extraordinary happened on the streets of Rome. The normal rules of society were suspended. Slaves could speak freely to their masters, even criticize them without punishment. In many households, roles were completely reversed. Masters served meals to slaves who sat at the main table, wearing the family's finest clothes. Can you imagine the psychological impact of that? In a rigidly hierarchical society where your social position determined every aspect of your life, suddenly there were days when everything could be questioned, when the established order was turned upside down. It wasn't a revolution, it was something more subtle and perhaps more powerful, a reminder that those hierarchies were human constructs, not immutable natural laws. It was as if Roman society once a year admitted that things could be different. The streets of Rome during Saturnalia were unrecognizable. The Forum, normally a place of serious business and political debates, turned into a festive market. Stalls sold small clay figurines called sigillaria, colorful wax candles, and all sorts of gifts. Yes, gift-giving was already central to these ancient celebrations. People greeted each other with Io Saturnalia, a joyful shout that echoed through the narrow alleys. Groups of friends went from house to house, singing, not unlike the Christmas carols we know today. But something deeper was happening beyond the surface festivities. People wore the pileus, a conical felt cap that was the symbol of freedom, normally worn only by newly freed slaves. During Saturnalia, everyone wore the pileus, rich and poor, free and enslaved. It was a powerful visual statement. On these days, everyone is equal, everyone is free. Even the emperor, if he was in Rome, joined the festivities, playing dice with common citizens, something unthinkable at any other time of the year. Think about the meals. Roman food during Saturnalia was abundant to excess. Tables groaned under the weight of elaborate dishes, roast suckling pigs stuffed with sausages and dates, fresh oysters brought from the coast, honeyed breads with spices imported from the east, fruits preserved in sweet wine. Wine flowed freely, not the watered-down everyday variety, but the best vintages, spiced and warmed to ward off December's chill. The aroma of cinnamon, cloves and nutmeg mingled with the smoke from hearths, creating an atmosphere that was both festive and comforting. But Saturnalia didn't happen in isolation in the ancient world. While Rome celebrated its festival of social inversion far to the north, beyond the empire's borders, in the dense and dark forests of Germania and Scandinavia, other peoples had their own ways of marking the winter solstice. They called this time Yule, and their celebrations were shaped by a completely different environment, colder, darker, more unforgiving. Imagine a Nordic village in mid-December. Snow covers everything in a thick, silent blanket. The sun, when it appears, barely rises above the trees before disappearing again. Nights are long, in some regions lasting 20 hours or more. Inside communal wooden houses with their low roofs and thick walls insulated with moss and turf, families gathered around central fireplaces. Smoke rose slowly toward an opening in the roof, and shadows danced on the walls. Yule was, above all, a celebration of light amid the darkness. The centerpiece of the festivities was the Yule log, a massive trunk carefully selected that was supposed to burn continuously for 12 days. It wasn't just any piece of wood. Families chose oaks or ash trees considered sacred, and the process of bringing the log home was a ritual in itself. Village men dragged it through the snow, singing ancient songs while children followed behind, their breaths forming white clouds in the frigid air. When the log was finally placed in the hearth and lit with a piece from the previous year's log, carefully saved for 12 months, the family gathered to watch the first flames. There was a belief that the way the log burned could predict the future. Tall, bright flames meant prosperity. Dark smoke or weak flames were signs of hardships ahead. We might smile at these superstitions today, but for those people, in a world where the difference between a good and a bad harvest could mean the difference between life and death, every sign was taken seriously. Homes were decorated with evergreen branches, pine, holly, ivy. These plants, which stayed green even at the peak of winter, were seen as symbols of eternal life, of continuity, of hope. They were visual reminders that life hadn't been completely conquered by winter, that spring would return. Holly branches, with their spiky leaves and bright red berries, were particularly prized. There were stories that they protected the home from evil spirits that roamed more freely during the long winter nights. Yule food was different from Roman abundance, but no less meaningful. It was survival food transformed into celebration. Pigs were slaughtered, animals that had been fattened all autumn specifically for this moment. The meat was slowly roasted over the fire, and nothing was wasted. Blood was used to make sausages, bones for broth, fat was rendered and stored for the hard months ahead. There were breads made from the last grains of the harvest, dense and dark, sweetened with honey from family hives. And there was mead, the sacred drink made from fermented honey, sometimes spiced with herbs and spices when available. Mead was served in ox horns or carved wooden cups, and drinking together was an act of community, of unity. People made oaths over mead, pledged loyalty, sealed agreements. It wasn't just a drink, it was a social sacrament. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of both Saturnalia and Yule was what they revealed about fundamental human needs. Why did such different societies, separated by thousands of miles, develop such similar celebrations at the darkest time of the year? Both involved light, candles in Rome, bonfires in the north. Both involved abundance of food and drink. Both suspended in some way the normal rules of daily life. Both were about community, about gathering, about warding off darkness and cold together. Are we so different today? When we decorate our homes with lights in December, when we gather with family and friends, when we exchange gifts and share special meals, aren't we, in a way, doing exactly what our ancestors did 2,000 years ago? The tools have changed, technology has evolved, but basic human needs for light, for warmth, for connection, for hope remain exactly the same. Perhaps these ancient celebrations have something to teach us about what really matters, something that transcends eras and cultures. And if you think about it, amid all the modern commercialization, isn't there something deeply comforting in knowing that we're participating in traditions that date back to the dawn of civilization? But how exactly did these pagan celebrations transform into the Christmas we know today? The transformation of ancient celebrations into something new didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, gradual process, full of cultural negotiations and pragmatic adaptations that spanned centuries. To understand how we went from Yule and Saturnalia to modern Christmas, we first need to understand the context in which Christianity was born and spread through the ancient world. In the early centuries of the Christian era, followers of Jesus were a small and often persecuted minority. They gathered in private homes, in catacombs, in discreet places where they could practice their faith away from the eyes of Roman authorities. For these early Christians, great pagan festivals like Saturnalia represented everything they rejected: polytheism, excessive indulgence, the immorality they associated with the decadent Roman world. But here's something interesting. The early Christians didn't celebrate Jesus' birth. There was no tradition of doing so in the first 200 or 300 years of Christianity. The important dates were Easter, which commemorated the resurrection, and baptism. The birth of Jesus simply wasn't part of the initial liturgical calendar. There were no gifts, no decorated trees, no special parties in December. So what changed? The answer lies in an event that completely transformed the fate of Christianity: the conversion of Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century. Suddenly, a religion that had been persecuted became not only legal but favored by the Roman state itself. Pagan temples began to be converted into churches. Ancient festivals needed to be reinterpreted or replaced. And here, church leaders faced a fascinating practical dilemma. You can't simply erase traditions that are rooted in culture for centuries. If you tell people they can no longer celebrate Saturnalia, that they can no longer light their Yule fires, that all their ancestral traditions are now forbidden, what happens? Resistance, resentment, secret continuation of ancient practices. The Christian leaders of the time were pragmatic enough to realize this. So instead of prohibiting, they adopted a different strategy: absorption and transformation. If people insisted on celebrating in December, why not give them a Christian reason to do so? At some point in the 4th century, the exact date is debated by historians, the Western Church established December 25th as the official date of Christ's birth. Not because there was any biblical or historical evidence that Jesus was actually born on that day. Scholars generally agree it probably wasn't in December, but because it was strategically convenient. December 25th fell right in the middle of the Roman Saturnalia and shortly after the winter solstice, when Yule was celebrated. It was a date that already had deep cultural significance. People were already accustomed to celebrating at that time. There was already an established infrastructure of festivity. All the church needed to do was redirect the focus of that celebration. And that's exactly what happened, but in fascinating and complex ways. The church couldn't simply declare, "Now you celebrate Christ's birth," and expect all ancient traditions to disappear. Instead, what emerged was a kind of cultural hybrid, a blend of Christian symbolism with deeply rooted pagan practices. People continued doing many of the things they had always done, but now with new meanings assigned to them. Think about the candles and lights. During Saturnalia, people lit candles as a symbol of light returning to the world after the solstice. In Yule, bonfires served the same purpose. The Christian Church didn't forbid these practices, instead, it reinterpreted them. Now the light symbolized Christ as the light of the world. The candles people lit were no longer to celebrate the physical sun, but the sun of justice, mentioned in the scriptures. Same practice, new meaning. Or consider gift-giving. During Saturnalia, it was customary to give small gifts, those clay figurines, candles, honey-covered nuts. This tradition was so ingrained that it would be impossible to eliminate it. So the Church Christianized it, connecting it to the gifts the Magi brought to the baby Jesus: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now, when you gave a gift in December, you were imitating the Magi, not participating in a pagan ritual. Same action, new justification. The evergreens that decorated homes during Yule, pine, holly, ivy, were also absorbed. The Church reinterpreted them as symbols of the eternal life promised by Christ. Holly, with its spiky leaves and red berries, came to represent the crown of thorns and Christ's blood. The evergreen pine symbolized eternal life. The traditions continued, but now they carried additional layers of Christian meaning overlaid on the original pagan ones. But this process of absorption wasn't uniform or peaceful everywhere. In different regions of Europe, the Christianization of winter celebrations took different forms depending on which local traditions were strongest. In Northern Europe, where Germanic and Norse traditions were deeply rooted, Yule resisted Christian transformation more strongly. For centuries, people continued celebrating both Yule and Christmas, often without making a clear distinction between the two. There were real tensions in this. Monks and priests wrote sermons condemning those who still lit Yule fires or made offerings to ancient deities. But ordinary people, especially in rural areas, far from centers of ecclesiastical power, continued their ancestral practices. They might go to Mass on Christmas Day and still drag the Yule log home, seeing no contradiction but a natural continuity of their traditions. Over time, what emerged was something that was neither purely Christian nor purely pagan, but a unique synthesis. December, celebrations became an amalgam of elements from different origins, all fused into a new and evolving tradition. And here's something we rarely consider. This process of cultural synthesis is still happening today. Each generation adds its own layers of meaning and practice to December celebrations. Think about how we celebrate now. How many of the elements we consider essential to Christmas have any real connection to the biblical story of Jesus' birth? The decorated tree. Pagan. Evergreen wreaths. Pagan. Elaborate gift exchanges. Pagan. Grand festive meals. Pagan. Lights everywhere. Pagan. Even the date of December 25th, chosen for strategic reasons, not historical ones. What we have is a celebration that is Christian in name and in some of its central symbols, but pagan in many of its actual practices. This isn't a criticism, it's simply a fascinating observation about how cultures work. They don't exist in isolated compartments. They blend, influence each other, absorb elements from one another. The Christmas we know today is the product of thousands of years of cultural exchanges, of negotiations between different belief systems, of ordinary people insisting on keeping their traditions even when religious or political authorities tried to change them. And there's something deeply human in that. Despite all the changes in religion, politics, technology, basic human needs remain constant. We need light in the darkness. We need warmth in the cold. We need to gather with those we love. We need moments of joy and celebration to balance the hardships of everyday life. These needs transcend any specific religion or culture. But the story doesn't end with the Christianization of pagan celebrations. That was just one phase of a much longer evolution. As medieval Europe gave way to the Renaissance, and then to the Reformation, and then to the modern era, December celebrations continued to change, adapting to new social and cultural contexts. And in each phase, there were tensions between those who wanted to preserve ancient traditions and those who wanted to reform or even abolish them completely. How did these tensions manifest, and what do they tell us about the cultural conflicts we still see today around December celebrations? The European Middle Ages were in many ways the golden age of winter celebrations. Christmas had become firmly established in the Christian calendar, but it retained much of its festive and excessive character inherited from Saturnalia and Yule. It was a time of feasting that lasted not just one day, but a full 12 days, from December 25th to January the 6th, Epiphany. During this period, normal work was suspended, and people indulged in celebrations that their Roman and Norse ancestors would certainly recognize. In great manor houses and castles, medieval Christmas was an explosion of hospitality. Lords opened their halls not just to family and other nobles, but to all their dependents, servants, workers, even travelers passing through the region. Long tables were set up and laden with food, roasted venison, geese, swans, peacocks presented with their intact plumage, elaborate pies stuffed with meat and fruits, dense, dark puddings made with precious spices brought from the east. There was a special character in these medieval celebrations, the Lord of Misrule. Chosen by lottery or election, usually from among the servants or younger members of the household, the Lord of Misrule reigned over the festivities with comic authority. He could issue absurd orders that everyone had to obey, mock the powerful without consequences, turn the established order upside down. Sound familiar? It was Roman Saturnalia reborn in medieval form, that same temporary inversion of social hierarchy. In villages, celebrations were simpler but no less meaningful. People went from house to house singing traditional songs, receiving food and drink in return. There were community dances, games, theatrical performances of biblical stories mixed with local folk elements. The local church was decorated with green branches, and special masses were held, but the religious aspect was just one part of a much broader and multifaceted celebration. But something more was happening in these medieval celebrations that deserves our attention. They served as a crucial social safety valve. Life in the Middle Ages was harsh, hierarchical, and rigidly controlled. Most people were born into a social position and died in it with no hope of mobility. Work was grueling and incessant. The church dictated not just what you believed, but how you lived every aspect of your life. In this context, the 12 days of Christmas offered a precious respite, a time when rules could be relaxed, where joy was not only allowed, but encouraged. Can you see the parallel with our time? How many people today live lives of constant work, trapped in rigid routines, feeling pressured by social and professional expectations? And isn't it exactly at the end of the year that we seek that same respite, that same pause in the normal demands of life? The circumstances have changed dramatically, but the human need for moments of release and celebration remains remarkably constant across the centuries. But not everyone viewed these celebrations favorably. Already by the end of the Middle Ages, there were voices within the church concerned about what they saw as pagan excesses disguised as Christian festivity. They looked at the drunkenness, the gluttony, the inversion of social hierarchies, and wondered, does this really honor Christ's birth? Or is it simply Saturnalia with a thin layer of Christian varnish? These tensions exploded dramatically during the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. Martin Luther and other early reformers weren't necessarily against Christmas celebrations themselves, but they were deeply concerned about what they saw as Catholic superstitions and pagan practices that had infiltrated Christianity. They wanted to purify the faith, return to what they considered original and authentic Christianity, free from all the additions and corruptions of the intervening centuries. In England, these tensions reached their climax in the 17th century during the English Civil War and the Puritan government that followed. The Puritans were radical Protestants who took the idea of religious purification to the extreme. They looked at Christmas celebrations and saw not a Christian feast but a pagan orgy. They saw people getting drunk, dancing, gambling, feasting for days on end, and all this supposedly in the name of Jesus Christ. To them it was blasphemy. In 1644, the English Parliament, controlled by Puritans, took an extraordinary measure. They officially banned the celebration of Christmas. Yes, you heard that right. Christmas was made illegal in England. The law declared that December 25th should be a normal working day, a day of fasting and reflection, not feasting. Churches were forbidden from holding special services, decorations were prohibited, shops were ordered to stay open. Anyone caught celebrating could be fined or even imprisoned. Imagine the reaction of ordinary people. For generations, for centuries, they had celebrated Christmas. It was part of the rhythm of their lives, one of the few joys in an often difficult world. And now, suddenly, distant authorities in London were saying it was all wrong, that it was sinful, that it had to stop. How do you think people reacted? There was widespread resistance. In many towns, people simply ignored the ban. They closed their shops, decorated their homes, held their parties, openly defying the law. In some places, there were violent clashes between soldiers trying to enforce the ban and crowds determined to celebrate. In Canterbury in 1647, there was virtually a riot when authorities tried to force shops to open on Christmas Day. But in other areas, especially where Puritans had more influence, the ban was more effective. Christmas simply disappeared from public life. There were no decorations in the streets, no special services in churches, no public parties. People who wanted to celebrate had to do so secretly in their homes with curtains drawn, always fearing that Puritan neighbours might report them. This ban lasted nearly 2 decades in England. It was only officially reversed in 1660 when the monarchy was restored, and King Charles II returned from exile. One of the first things he did was restore Christmas as an official holiday. People celebrated not just the king's return, but the return of their favourite feast. Churches were redecorated, parties were held, and Christmas returned to English public life. But something interesting happened during those years of prohibition. Christmas didn't return exactly as it had been before. It had been interrupted, questioned, forced to justify itself. And when it returned, it was a bit more restrained, a bit less wild than it had been in the Middle Ages. The more extreme celebrations, the more radical social inversions gradually faded away. Christmas began to become more domesticated, more focused on family, and less on the wider community, more private and less public. Did you know this wasn't the only time Christmas was banned? In the Puritan colonies of New England in America, the celebration of Christmas was also prohibited. In Massachusetts from 1659 to 1681, anyone caught celebrating Christmas could be fined 5 shillings, a significant amount at the time. The Puritans who had fled England in search of religious freedom were now imposing their own religious restrictions, banning a celebration that millions of Christians around the world considered sacred. If you're watching this from the United States, isn't it fascinating to know there was a time when Christmas was illegal where you live? That your Puritan ancestors saw this celebration now so central to American culture as something dangerous and corrupt. And here's a question worth considering. What do these prohibitions tell us about the nature of cultural traditions? The Puritans had political power, they had the law on their side, they had soldiers to enforce their rules. But they couldn't eliminate Christmas. Why? Because you can't simply legislate against traditions that are deeply rooted in people's culture and psyche. You can suppress them temporarily, drive them underground, but they survive, waiting for the opportunity to resurface. We see this repeatedly in history. Authoritarian regimes try to control or eliminate cultural celebrations they consider problematic, and sometimes succeed for a time. But traditions have remarkable resilience. They adapt, change form, find new meanings, but persist. Christmas survived the Puritan ban just as it had survived the transition from paganism to Christianity centuries earlier. It would continue to survive and evolve through all the dramatic changes the following centuries would bring. But when Christmas returned, it entered a world that was beginning to change rapidly. The Industrial Revolution was on the horizon, bringing social and economic transformations that would completely reshape European and American society. And these changes would have a profound impact on how Christmas was celebrated and understood. What happens to a traditional feast when the world around it transforms from agrarian to industrial, from rural to urban, from communal to individualistic? The 19th century brought changes so profound to Western society that it's hard to overstate their impact. The Industrial Revolution was transforming entire countries from agrarian societies into industrial powerhouses. People who, for generations, had lived in small rural villages where everyone knew each other and life followed the rhythms of the seasons, now crowded into rapidly growing industrial cities. They worked in factories, not fields. They lived in densely populated neighborhoods, not scattered rural communities. And their lives were governed by the factory clock, not the rising and setting of the sun. In this new industrial world, many ancient traditions began to seem out of place or simply impossible to maintain. The communal celebrations that had characterized medieval and Renaissance Christmas depended on social structures that were disappearing rapidly. When you worked on a local farm for a lord, there was an expectation of mutual hospitality during the holidays. But when you worked in an anonymous factory for an owner you never met personally, those expectations no longer applied. By the early 19th century, Christmas was in many places in a kind of decline. It was no longer the grand 12-day festival it had been. In many industrial cities, it was just another workday, or at most a one-day holiday. The old traditions of going house to house singing, community parties, temporary social inversion, all of that was fading away. To many observers of the time, it seemed Christmas might simply disappear, become a relic of a rural past that had no place in the modern industrial world. But then something remarkable happened. Christmas didn't disappear. Instead, it was reinvented. And the place where this reinvention happened most dramatically was Victorian England, during the long reign of Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901. The Victorians took Christmas, which was dying as a public and communal festival, and transformed it into a private and family-oriented celebration. They created many of the traditions we now consider essential and timeless, but which in reality are only about 150 years old. Consider the Christmas tree. Yes, there were ancient traditions of bringing evergreens indoors during winter that dates back to Yule and beyond. But the specific practice of having a whole tree cut and brought inside, decorated with ornaments and placed as the centerpiece of the family celebration, that was relatively new in England. It was popularized by Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's German husband, who brought the tradition from his homeland. In 1848, an illustration was published showing Queen Victoria, Prince Albert, and their children gathered around a decorated Christmas tree. The image was widely reproduced and had an enormous impact. If the royal family did it, then it was respectable, it was modern, it was what aspiring families should do. Within a few years, Christmas trees became common in middle-class homes across England, and the trend quickly spread to other countries. But think about what this tree represented. It was no longer about communal rituals or social inversion. It was about the nuclear family gathered in their private home. The tree stood in the living room, not the public square. It was decorated by the family, not the community. It was the center of a domestic and intimate celebration, not a public and exuberant feast. Christmas was being reimagined as a fundamentally private and family affair. This transformation was accompanied by changes in who received gifts and why. In ancient celebrations, gifts were exchanged among adults as gestures of friendship and goodwill. But the Victorians increasingly focused gift-giving on children. Christmas became, above all, a holiday for children. Gifts were placed under the tree on Christmas Eve or Christmas morning, creating a magical moment of discovery and childlike joy. This reflected broader changes in how Victorian society viewed childhood. For the first time in history, childhood was being recognized as a distinct stage of life that deserved special protection and nurturing. Children were no longer seen just as small adults who should start working as soon as they were physically able. There was a growing sentiment that children should have time to play, to learn, to be innocent. And Christmas became a focal point for expressing and celebrating this new view of childhood. Christmas cards were also a Victorian invention. The first commercial Christmas card was produced in London in 1843. Before that, people might write letters during the holiday season, but the idea of a card specifically designed to send Christmas greetings was new, and it exploded in popularity. Within a few decades, millions of Christmas cards were being sent each year, facilitated by the expanding postal system and falling printing costs. These cards served an important purpose in the new urban and industrial world. People were more geographically dispersed than ever. Families that had lived in the same village for generations now found themselves scattered across different cities, even different countries, in search of work. Christmas cards offered a way to maintain connections, to remind distant relatives that you still thought of them, that you were still part of the same family despite the physical distance. But perhaps the most significant contribution of the Victorian era to modern Christmas was literary. In 1843, Charles Dickens published A Christmas Carol, and it's hard to overstate the impact of that little novella. The story of Ebenezer Scrooge, the miser transformed by the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future, perfectly captured the spirit of what the Victorians wanted Christmas to be. Dickens' message was clear. Christmas should be a time of generosity, compassion, thinking of the less fortunate. Scrooge is redeemed not through religion or moralizing, but through a rediscovery of his own humanity and that of others. He learns to value family, friendship, the simple joy of giving without expecting anything in return. And all of this happens in the context of a family and domestic Christmas celebration. The Cratchit family gathered around their modest dinner table, Bob Cratchit carrying little Tim Tiny on his shoulders. A Christmas Carol was an instant success and has remained continuously in print since its publication. It shaped how generations of people think about Christmas. Many of the phrases we use, bah, humbug, God bless us everyone, come straight from Dickens. And the very structure of the story, with its journey of personal transformation and redemption, became a model that countless Christmas stories since have imitated. But there's something deeper happening in A Christmas Carol that's worth noting. Dickens was writing at a time of intense social anxiety. Industrialization had created unprecedented wealth, but also unprecedented poverty and inequality. Industrial cities were filled with slums where workers lived in terrible conditions. Children worked in factories and mines. There was a growing fear that society was fragmenting, that the bonds holding people together were unraveling. Dickens's Christmas offered an answer to these anxieties. It suggested that despite all the changes and divisions, there were still common human values that everyone could share. Rich and poor, employers and employees, all could unite in the Christmas spirit. It was a comforting, perhaps even sentimental vision, but powerful. And it helped establish Christmas as a time when normal social divisions should be, at least temporarily, set aside. Can you see the parallels with our own time? We live in an era of rapid technological change, growing economic inequality, anxiety about social fragmentation, and we still turn to Christmas as a time when we're supposed to remember what unites us rather than what divides us. We still tell stories about personal transformation and redemption. We still emphasize generosity and compassion. We still try to create, at least for a few days, a space where the normal worries of the world can be set aside. But there were contradictions in the Victorian vision of Christmas that are important to recognize. While Dickens and others celebrated Christmas as a time of generosity and thinking of the poor, the reality was often different. Industrialization was making some individuals incredibly rich while leaving millions in poverty. The very factories and shops that sold Christmas decorations and gifts often employed workers, including children, in terrible conditions. There was also a growing commercialization of Christmas that some observers were already criticizing in the Victorian era. Shops began creating elaborate window displays to attract Christmas shoppers. Advertisements promoted products as perfect gifts. The act of buying gifts, which had been a relatively minor part of ancient celebrations, was becoming increasingly central. Christmas was becoming good for business, and business was shaping more and more how Christmas was celebrated. This raises questions we still struggle to answer today. How much commercialization is too much? When does gift-giving shift from a meaningful gesture of love and friendship to a stressful and transactional obligation? How do we balance the desire to celebrate generously with concerns about consumerism and sustainability? The Victorians were the first to face these questions in their modern form, but they certainly weren't the last. And there was another tension in the Victorian reinvention of Christmas. By making it a fundamentally private and family celebration, something was lost from the ancient communal traditions. Medieval and Renaissance Christmas had been about entire communities gathering. There was a public and shared dimension that created social bonds beyond the immediate family. The Victorian Christmas focused on the nuclear family gathered in their private home, was more intimate, but also more isolated. This tension between public and private, communal and family, remains with us. Many people today feel Christmas has become overly privatized, overly focused on individual consumption and the nuclear family at the expense of broader community connections. There's a longing for something more like the communal celebrations of the past. But how do you recreate that in a world where the community structures that supported those celebrations have changed so dramatically? The Victorians reinvented Christmas for their time, creating traditions that seemed timeless, but were actually responses to specific historical circumstances. And those traditions proved remarkably durable. Many of them still form the core of how we celebrate today. But the world continued changing after the Victorian era, and Christmas continued evolving with it. The 20th century would bring its own transformations, its own additions to the ever-evolving tradition. How did Christmas navigate world wars, the Great Depression, the rise of mass culture and global media? The 20th century began with optimism. The Victorian era had left a legacy of technological progress, economic expansion, and relative stability, at least for the middle and upper classes of the Western world. Christmas, now firmly established as a family celebration centered on children, gifts, and domestic gatherings, seemed like a solid and unchanging tradition. But the century that was just beginning would bring changes and challenges that would test and transform these traditions in ways no one could have foreseen. World War I, which began in 1914, was a shock to the European consciousness. For the first time, a large-scale industrial war involved entire nations, not just professional armies. Millions of men were conscripted and sent to the trenches. And that meant that for the first time in generations, many families would face Christmas with empty chairs at the table, with fathers, brothers, and sons absent, fighting on distant battlefields. The Christmas of 1914 produced one of the most extraordinary and moving moments in military history, the Christmas truce. Along several sections of the Western Front, German and British soldiers who had spent months trying to kill each other spontaneously stopped fighting on Christmas Eve. They emerged from their trenches, met in no man's land between the lines, exchanged gifts, chocolate, cigarettes, uniform buttons, as souvenirs, sang Christmas carols together, and in some places even played soccer. Think about the depth of what this represents. These men had been trained to see each other as enemies, as less than human. They had shot at each other, thrown grenades, tried to kill one another. But on Christmas, even amid the horror of trench warfare, something deeper emerged. Christmas evoked a shared humanity that transcended national divisions and wartime propaganda. For a brief moment, they weren't German and British soldiers. They were just men far from home, longing for peace and normalcy. The truce didn't last, of course. Military commands on both sides were horrified and took measures to ensure it never happened again. In the following years of the war, such fraternizations were strictly forbidden and punished. But the fact that it happened even once says something powerful about the cultural and emotional significance Christmas had acquired. It was stronger than war, at least for a moment. For families at home, Christmas during the war was a time of mixed emotions. There were efforts to maintain traditions, to create some sense of normalcy for children. But there was also an acute awareness of absences, dangers, uncertainty. Gifts were more modest due to rationing. Letters from soldiers at the front were read and reread. Prayers were said for safe returns. Christmas became not just a celebration, but also a painful reminder of everything the war had interrupted. When the war finally ended in 1918, there was an understandable desire to return to normalcy, to rebuild the traditions that had been disrupted. The 1920s saw a resurgence of Christmas celebrations, perhaps even more elaborate than before, as if people were trying to make up for the lost years. But the world had changed, millions had died, empires had fallen, and a new technology was about to transform how people experience Christmas: the radio. Radio brought something new to Christmas celebrations: simultaneous, shared experiences on a national and even international scale. For the first time, millions of people could hear the same Christmas message, the same songs, the same special programs, all at the same time. In 1932, King George V of England made the first Royal Christmas radio broadcast, speaking directly to his subjects across the British Empire. It was a form of connection that would have been impossible in any previous era. But then came the Great Depression, beginning with the 1929 stock market crash and extending through the 1930s. Suddenly, millions of people found themselves unemployed, without income, struggling to feed their families. Christmas, with its growing emphasis on bought gifts and elaborate celebrations, became a painful reminder of everything many families could no longer afford. There were stories of fathers staying up all night before Christmas, worried because they had no money to buy gifts for their children, of families relying on charity for any kind of Christmas meal, of children who learned not to expect much, not to ask for much, because they knew their parents simply didn't have the means. Christmas exposed economic inequalities in particularly cruel ways. But there was also resilience and creativity. People made gifts instead of buying them. Communities organized collective celebrations so no one was left completely without. There was a return in some ways to older and less commercial forms of celebration. And there was a renewed emphasis on the message that Christmas should be about more than material things. It should be about family, love, hope, values that couldn't be bought or sold. Then came World War II, even more devastating than the first. Again, families were separated. Again, Christmas was marked by absences and anxieties. But this time, there were also city bombings, child evacuations, even stricter rationing. In England during the Blitz, people celebrated Christmas in underground air raid shelters while bombs fell overhead. They sang carols to drown out the sound of explosions, trying to create some sense of normalcy and comfort for terrified children. There was something deeply moving about these wartime Christmas celebrations. People decorating tiny trees in air raid shelters, soldiers in prisoner of war camps creating improvised decorations from whatever materials they could find, families saving their rations for weeks to have something special on Christmas. These gestures, made in such difficult circumstances, revealed how important Christmas had become as a symbol of hope, continuity, humanity, persisting even in the worst conditions. And then the war ended, and the world entered a new era. The post-war years, especially the 1950s and 1960s, saw unprecedented prosperity in many parts of the Western world. The middle class expanded dramatically. More people had more disposable income than ever, and this was reflected in Christmas celebrations, which became increasingly elaborate and commercialized. Television, which became common in homes during the 1950s, brought a new dimension to Christmas. Christmas specials became major cultural events. Families gathered around the TV to watch together, creating new traditions. And TV advertising took Christmas commercialization to new heights. Specific toys were heavily promoted, creating demands that parents felt pressure to meet. It was also in this era that a particular figure became absolutely central to the modern Christmas, especially in North America: Santa Claus, or Father Christmas. Now, the idea of a figure who brought gifts to children at Christmas had ancient roots. St. Nicholas in Europe, Father Christmas in England, and various other folk figures. But the modern version of Santa Claus, with his red suit, round belly, flying reindeer, and workshop at the North Pole, was largely a 20th century creation. The iconic image of Santa Claus was standardized largely through advertising, particularly in campaigns by a major soft drink company in the 1930s and 1940s. This image was then reinforced and elaborated through movies, TV shows, children's books, and countless other forms of media. Santa became an industry in himself. Malls had Santas where children could sit and make wishes. Letters were written to the North Pole. Online trackers followed his journey around the world on Christmas Eve. For children, Santa added an element of magic and mystery to Christmas. There was the excitement of leaving cookies and milk, of waking up on Christmas morning to see if he had come, of trying to stay awake to catch him in action. But there was also something more complex happening. Santa became a form of social control. Children were reminded that he was always watching, that he knew if you had been good or bad, and that gifts were rewards for good behavior. And there was the inevitable question of when and how children would learn the truth. For many children, discovering that Santa wasn't real was a significant, sometimes traumatic moment. The first time they realized that adults, including their own parents, had deliberately deceived them. Some psychologists argued this was harmful. Others said it was an important part of growing up, of learning to distinguish fantasy from reality. The debate continues to this day, but perhaps the most interesting aspect of the Santa phenomenon is what it reveals about how Christmas had changed. In ancient celebrations, Saturnalia, Yule, there was no central figure distributing gifts. Gifts were exchanged between people, expressions of real relationships. But Santa is a mythical figure external to real family relationships. He brings gifts not because of a personal connection, but because that's what he does. It's his function. This reflects, in a way, how Christmas had become more impersonal, more market-mediated. Gifts were increasingly store-bought items, not homemade. They came from Santa, not from specific people with whom you had real relationships. The act of giving had become, in a sense, outsourced to a mythical figure, removing some of the personal connection that had been central to older forms of gift exchange. As the 20th century progressed, Christmas continued to evolve. The 1960s and 1970s saw questioning of many established traditions, including Christmas. There were criticisms of consumerism, materialism, commercialization. Some young people rejected traditional Christmas celebrations as hypocritical or empty. There was a desire to find more authentic and meaningful ways to celebrate, or not to celebrate at all. But Christmas proved remarkably resilient to these criticisms. It adapted, incorporated some of the concerns, but continued as a dominant cultural celebration. And as the century approached its end, new technologies, personal computers, the internet, cell phones, began to change again how people experienced and celebrated Christmas. You could now send Christmas greetings instantly to anywhere in the world. You could shop for Christmas online without leaving home. You could connect with distant family through video calls. Each of these technological changes subtly shifted what Christmas meant and how it was practiced. And the process of change and adaptation continues to this day. The Christmas we celebrate now is simultaneously very ancient, still echoing traditions from 2,000 years ago, and very new, constantly being reshaped by the circumstances and technologies of the present moment. But through all these changes, certain fundamental human needs remain constant. We need light in the darkness, warmth in the cold, connection with others, moments of joy and hope. And that's why Christmas, in some form, will probably continue as long as these needs exist. But how exactly do we celebrate today? And what do our current practices reveal about our contemporary values and anxieties? We now live in an era of unprecedented globalization. Information, ideas, images, and products circulate around the world at speeds unimaginable to our ancestors. And Christmas, which began as specific local celebrations in particular regions of Europe, has become a truly global phenomenon. But this globalization doesn't mean uniformity. On the contrary, Christmas today exists in incredibly diverse forms, adapted to vastly different cultural, religious, and economic contexts around the world. Consider Japan, where less than 2% of the population is Christian. You might expect Christmas to be irrelevant there, but in fact it's widely celebrated, though in ways that would be unrecognizable to someone familiar only with Western traditions. In Japan, Christmas isn't a religious holiday or even an official public holiday. It's primarily a commercial and romantic celebration. Young couples go out for romantic dinners. Stores and streets are elaborately decorated with lights. And there's a peculiar tradition that developed, eating fried chicken from a specific fast food chain on Christmas Eve. How did this happen? In the 1970s, that restaurant chain launched a marketing campaign promoting its chicken as an alternative to the traditional Christmas turkey, which wasn't common in Japan. The campaign was so successful that it became a national tradition. People now make reservations weeks in advance to secure their Christmas chicken. Lines form around the block. It's a perfect example of how Christmas can be completely recontextualized when transplanted to a different culture. Or consider India, another non-Christian majority country where Christmas is widely celebrated, especially in urban areas. There, Christmas has fused with local traditions in fascinating ways. Homes may be decorated with Christmas lights, but also with rangoli, colorful traditional patterns made on the floor. Santa Claus may appear, but alongside Hindu deities. Traditional Christmas foods are served alongside Indian dishes. It's a cultural hybrid that would have been impossible in eras of lesser global connectivity. Even in predominantly Christian countries, the variations are enormous. In Latin America, Christmas celebrations have a very different character from those in North America or Europe. There's more emphasis on religious aspects, elaborate nativity scenes, special masses, processions. Celebrations often extend to Three Kings Day on January 6th, when traditional gifts are given. And there are unique traditions like the Posadas in Mexico, where people reenact Mary and Joseph's search for shelter, going from house to house, singing. In Australia and New Zealand, Christmas falls in the middle of summer. This creates an interesting disconnect with many traditional Christmas tropes, which are so tied to winter. Snow, fireplaces, warm clothing. Australians have adapted, creating traditions like beach Christmas barbecues, Santa in shorts, summer-themed decorations. It's a reminder that many things we consider essential to Christmas are actually specific to the Northern Hemisphere context. But the globalization of Christmas isn't just about adaptation and diversity. There are also concerns about cultural homogenization, about the imposition of Western, particularly American, traditions on other cultures. When you see Christmas decorations in malls in Dubai, Christmas trees in Beijing, Santa in Manila, are you witnessing genuine cultural exchange or a form of cultural imperialism? This is a complex question with no easy answers. On one hand, no one is being forced to celebrate Christmas. People in non-Christian countries who adopt elements of Christmas celebrations are making choices, often adapting those traditions in ways that make sense in their own cultural contexts. On the other hand, there is a real power imbalance. Western culture, and particularly American culture, dominates global media, advertising, entertainment. When children around the world watch the same Christmas movies, see the same ads, are exposed to the same images, it inevitably shapes their desires and expectations. And there are real economic issues at play. Christmas has become a massive economic engine. For many retailers, Christmas sales can represent a huge portion of their annual revenue. There's constant pressure to extend the Christmas shopping season, to create new traditions that require new products. Have you noticed how Christmas decorations appear in stores earlier each year? How Black Friday, originally an American phenomenon the day after Thanksgiving, has spread to countries that don't even celebrate Thanksgiving. This leads us to one of the central contradictions of modern Christmas, the tension between its stated meanings and its economic realities. Christmas is supposed to be about generosity, love, family, peace, spiritual values over material ones. But in practice, for many people, it has become primarily about shopping, consumption, spending. There's an entire industry dedicated to making us buy more. More gifts, more decorations, more special foods, more of everything. The statistics are staggering. In the United States, consumers spend hundreds of billions of dollars during the Christmas season each year. The average American spends over $1,000 on gifts, decorations, and other Christmas-related expenses, and these figures keep growing. There's real pressure, especially for families with children, to meet expectations, to provide the magical Christmas experience that media and advertising promise. But this pressure has costs. Many people go into significant debt from Christmas spending, debt that takes months to pay off. There's stress about finding the perfect gifts, about decorating adequately, about creating the perfect meals. For many, Christmas becomes not a source of joy but of anxiety and exhaustion. There's even a term for it, Christmas stress, or Christmas depression, recognizing that for many people, this time of year is emotionally difficult, not joyful. And there are environmental impacts we're only beginning to confront seriously. The amount of waste generated during Christmas is enormous. Wrapping paper, packaging, disposable decorations, uneaten food, unwanted gifts that end up in landfills. The energy consumption from Christmas decorations multiplied across millions of homes is significant. The carbon emissions from all the transportation involved, people traveling to visit family, products shipped around the world, are substantial. There's growing awareness of these issues and attempts to celebrate in more sustainable ways. Some people are opting for homemade or experiential gifts instead of bought products. Others are scaling back their celebrations, focusing more on time together and less on material things. There are movements for green or ethical Christmases, emphasizing local, sustainable, and fair trade products. But these remain minority choices against the tide of dominant consumerism. Another modern contradiction: Christmas is supposed to be about family and togetherness, but for many people, it's a painful reminder of fragmented or dysfunctional families. Not everyone has loving families to gather with. Some are estranged from their relatives, others have lost loved ones and feel those absences more acutely during the holidays. Some come from families where gatherings are tense or even hostile. The idealized image of the happy family gathered around the Christmas tree doesn't match the reality of many lives. And there are issues of inclusion and diversity. As Western societies have become more multicultural and multi-religious, the dominance of Christmas as the December celebration has become more problematic. Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, and other non-Christian children often feel excluded or marginalized during the Christmas season. Schools and workplaces struggle to balance acknowledging Christmas with respect for other traditions. Some argue that Christmas has become so secularized that it's no longer really a Christian holiday, so everyone can participate. Others insist that, despite secularization, Christmas remains fundamentally Christian, and that its cultural dominance is a form of Christian privilege. There are debates about whether public spaces should have Christmas decorations, whether schools should have Christmas pageants, whether companies should say Merry Christmas, or the more inclusive Happy Holidays. These debates may seem trivial, but they touch on deeper issues of identity, belonging, and cultural power. Who has the right to define how public space is used? How do we balance the traditions of the majority with respect for minorities? How do we create societies where everyone feels included and valued? These aren't easy questions, and Christmas has become a focal point where they are debated and contested. There's also the question of authenticity. Many people feel modern Christmas has become too commercialized, too artificial, too far removed from any real meaning. There's a longing for something more authentic, more meaningful. But what would that be? A return to traditional religious celebrations? A renewed focus on family values? A rejection of consumerism in favor of simpler forms of celebration? Different people have very different answers. Some try to create their own traditions, consciously choosing which elements of Christmas to adopt and which to reject. Others engage with established traditions but try to infuse them with personal meaning. Still others reject Christmas altogether, seeing it as irredeemably corrupted or simply irrelevant to their lives. The diversity of approaches reflects the diversity of modern society. And then there's technology, which continues to change how we experience Christmas. Social media has added a new dimension. People now share their Christmas celebrations online, creating carefully curated representations of their festive lives. This can create additional pressures to make everything look perfect, to have the most beautiful tree, the most impressive gifts, the most elaborate meal. There's a performativity to modern Christmas that's amplified by social media. But technology also enables new forms of connection. Families separated geographically can gather virtually through video calls. People can maintain traditions across borders and time zones. There's something touching about seeing grandparents watching their grandchildren open gifts through a screen, even if they can't be there in person. Technology doesn't replace physical presence, but it offers something where there would have been nothing before. Modern Christmas, then, is full of contradictions and tensions. It's simultaneously global and local, traditional and constantly changing, religious and secular, about generosity and about consumerism, about togetherness and about exclusion. It's celebrated by billions, but experienced in infinitely varied ways. And through all these contradictions, it continues to exert a remarkable cultural power. Why? What is it about Christmas that makes it so resilient, so adaptable, so central to so many lives, even as its forms and meanings change so dramatically? Perhaps the answer lies not in the specifics of how we celebrate, but in the deeper human needs that Christmas, in all its forms, continues to fulfill. If you look at all the transformations Christmas has undergone over 2 millennia, from Roman Saturnalia to Norse Yule, from medieval Christianization to Victorian reinvention, from world wars to the digital age, one question emerges. What remains constant? Beneath all the changes in forms, symbols, specific practices, is there something fundamental that continues to draw people to these winter celebrations, generation after generation? The answer perhaps lies in the most basic and universal human needs that haven't changed since our ancestors gathered around cave fires telling stories to ward off the darkness, needs that transcend culture, religion, historical era, and Christmas in all its varied forms has been remarkably effective at fulfilling these needs, which is why it continues to thrive even in radically different contexts from those in which it originated. Start with the most literal need, light. Our ancient ancestors had a genuine fear that the sun might not return, that darkness might permanently prevail. We no longer have that fear. We know the winter solstice marks the turning point, that days will begin to lengthen again. But something deeper remains. Darkness still affects our mood, our energy, our psychological well-being. There's a reason seasonal affective disorder is a recognized medical condition, why so many people feel depressed during the dark winter months. And so we light up. Millions and millions of lights. We adorn our homes with them, our streets, our entire cities. Some people spend days installing elaborate light displays. We drive through neighborhoods just to see the lights. There's something deeply satisfying, almost primordial, about seeing all that light against the December darkness. It's not rational. We don't need these lights for safety or visibility, but we need them for something deeper, something emotional and psychological. Christmas lights are a declaration against the darkness, both literal and metaphorical. They say, darkness will not prevail. Light persists. Hope persists. It's the same impulse that led Romans to light candles during Saturnalia, Nordics to keep their Yule fires burning for 12 days. The tools have changed from bonfires to candles to electric bulbs to LEDs, but the underlying need remains identical. Then there's the need for warmth, both physical and emotional. Winter is cold. That's a physical reality that modern technology can mitigate but not completely eliminate. And there's something about the cold that makes us crave warmth in ways that go beyond physical comfort. We want emotional warmth, the feeling of being welcomed, cared for, part of something larger than ourselves. Christmas celebrations have always involved gathering in warmed spaces. Romans gathered in homes heated by hearths. Nordics huddled in their communal halls around central fires. Victorians gathered in heated living rooms. We gather in homes with central heating, but the impulse is the same. There's a reason so many iconic Christmas images involve fireplaces, even in homes that don't have functional ones. The fireplace is a powerful symbol of warmth, comfort, home. And emotional warmth comes from gathering with others. Christmas is fundamentally about human connection. Yes, the specific forms of connection have changed, from broad communal celebrations to nuclear family gatherings to virtual connections through screens. But the underlying need for connection remains. We are social animals. We need others. And Christmas provides a structure, an excuse, a set of rituals that facilitate these connections. Think about how people travel for Christmas. Millions make arduous, expensive, and sometimes dangerous journeys to be with family during the holidays. Airports get crowded, roads get congested, people endure snowstorms, delays, all kinds of inconveniences. Why? Because the need to be together, to maintain those connections, is powerful enough to overcome all those obstacles. And it's not just about biological family. For many people, especially those estranged from their families of origin, Christmas is about chosen families, friends who become family, communities that offer belonging. There are traditions like Friendsgiving and Friendsmas, recognizing that family isn't just about blood, but about who we choose to have in our lives. Christmas has adapted to accommodate these modern realities while still fulfilling the basic need for connection. There's also the need for abundance, or at least the illusion of abundance. Life for most people, throughout most of history, has been characterized by scarcity. There was never enough food, never enough warmth, never enough security. And winter was the time of greatest scarcity, when autumn's stored food had to last until spring, when every day was about making resources stretch. In that context, winter celebrations were precious moments of deliberate abundance. You slaughtered animals you couldn't feed through the winter anyway. You used the last grains of the harvest to make special breads. You opened the last bottles of wine or mead. It was temporary and strategic abundance, but abundance nonetheless. And it was psychologically crucial, a reminder that life wasn't just about survival, that there were moments of pleasure and excess. Today, at least in the developed world, most people don't live in constant scarcity, but the psychological need for abundance, for occasional excess, remains, and Christmas provides that. Christmas tables are traditionally overloaded with food, far more than anyone could reasonably eat. Gifts are piled under trees, decorations cover every available surface. There's a deliberate excess that's part of the point. Of course, this can go too far, and often does. Excess can become waste. Abundance can become gluttony. But the underlying impulse to create a moment of fullness, of generosity, of more than enough, is deeply human. It's a way of affirming that life can be more than just meeting basic needs, that there's room for joy and celebration. Related to that is the need for generosity and reciprocity. Humans are unique in the animal kingdom in our capacity for complex forms of exchange and reciprocity. We give gifts, do favors, create elaborate networks of mutual obligation and support. And these exchanges aren't just transactional, they create and reinforce social bonds. They say, I think of you, I value you, you matter to me. Gift giving has been central to winter celebration since Roman Saturnalia, probably before. And while the specific forms have changed dramatically, from small handmade clay figurines to manufactured products bought in stores to next-day online deliveries, the social function remains the same. Gifts are material expressions of immaterial relationships. They say something that can be hard to say in words. Of course, this can get complicated. Gifts can become stressful obligations instead of joyful expressions of affection. There can be anxiety about spending enough, finding the right thing, appropriate reciprocity. The commercialization of Christmas has turned gift-giving into something often more about economic transactions than emotional connections. But even with all these complications, the practice persists because it touches something fundamental about how humans relate to each other. There's also the need for ritual and tradition. Humans are creatures of habit and pattern. We find comfort in repetition, in knowing what to expect, in doing the same things in the same way year after year. Rituals give us structure, predictability, a sense of continuity through time. They connect us to our past and our future, creating a narrative of our lives. Christmas is rich in rituals. Some are religious, masses, prayers, readings of biblical stories. Others are secular, decorating the tree, hanging stockings, leaving cookies for Santa, singing specific songs, eating specific foods. Each family develops its own specific traditions, its own little rituals that may mean nothing to outsiders, but are deeply meaningful to family members. And there's comfort in that. In a world that often feels like it's changing too fast, where uncertainty is constant, Christmas rituals offer something stable. You may not know what the next year will bring, but you know that in December, you'll decorate the tree, you'll make that special recipe, you'll watch that specific movie. There's psychological security in that predictability. But rituals also connect us across generations. When you do something the same way your parents did, the same way your grandparents did, you're participating in something larger than yourself. You're part of an unbroken chain that stretches back in time and will continue forward. There's a kind of immortality in that. Your actions echo those of your ancestors and will be echoed by your descendants. This is especially powerful around food. Recipes are passed down through generations. You make your grandmother's Christmas cookies using her recipe, perhaps even her cookie cutters. And when you bite into that cookie, you're transported back to her kitchen, to childhood memories. And when your own children or grandchildren make those same cookies, they'll remember you. Food becomes a vehicle for memory and connection across time. There's also the need for hope, especially in difficult times. Christmas has always offered that. For the ancients, it was hope that the sun would return, that spring would come again, that life would continue. For Christians, it was hope of salvation, redemption, a better world to come. For Victorians, it was hope that despite all the changes and upheavals of industrialization, fundamental human values would persist. For those who lived through wars and depressions, it was hope that peace and prosperity would return. And today, we live in times of significant anxiety about climate change, political instability, economic inequality, so many things. Christmas offers a temporary respite from these anxieties, but also something more, a reminder that humanity has endured hard times before and survived, that people have always found ways to create joy and meaning, even in the most challenging circumstances, that there's resilience in the human spirit. Christmas lights shining in the darkness are literally that, a symbol of hope, of light persisting against the dark. And perhaps we need those symbols now as much as our ancestors did. The specific threats we face are different, but the need for hope is the same. Finally, there's the need for meaning. Humans are unique in our capacity and need to find meaning in our experiences. It's not enough just to exist. We need our existence to mean something, to be part of some larger narrative, and celebrations like Christmas help us create that meaning. For the religious, Christmas has obvious theological meaning. It celebrates the birth of their Savior, a pivotal moment in the story of salvation. But even for the non-religious, Christmas can carry deep meaning. It can be about values, generosity, compassion, love, family. It can be about continuity, keeping traditions, honoring the past. It can be about community, belonging to something larger than yourself. It can be about hope, affirming that life can be good, that there are reasons for joy. The specific forms of meaning people find in Christmas vary enormously, but the need for meaning is universal. And Christmas, with its rich history, multiple symbols, flexibility, and adaptability, offers a framework where people can create and find meaning in ways that resonate with their own lives and values. So perhaps that's what explains Christmas's remarkable resilience through 2 millennia of dramatic change. It's not about the specific forms, trees or candles, gifts or feasts, Santa or the baby Jesus. Those are all surface expressions of deeper needs. And as long as those needs persist, where for light in the darkness, warmth in the cold, connection in isolation, abundance in scarcity, hope in despair, meaning in a world that often seems meaningless, something like Christmas will continue to exist. The forms will change, as they always have, but the essence will remain. But if these needs are so universal, why has Christmas specifically become the dominant form of fulfilling them in the Western world and beyond? And what have we lost when other traditions were marginalized or forgotten? Chapter 8. What was lost along the way? When we look at the history of Christmas and its origins in ancient celebrations, Like Saturnalia and Yule, it's easy to focus on what survived, on what was passed down through generations, adapted and transformed, but still recognizable in some way. But there's another equally important story, the story of what was lost. Traditions that disappeared completely, meanings that were forgotten, practices that were deliberately suppressed. And by examining these losses, we can better understand not only where we came from, but also what's missing from our contemporary celebrations. Start with the most radical aspect of Saturnalia, the temporary social inversion. During those days in ancient Rome, slaves could speak freely to their masters, even criticize them. In many households, roles were literally reversed. Masters served slaves. Everyone wore the pileus, the cap of freedom. It was an explicit, though temporary, acknowledgement that social hierarchies were human constructs, not natural laws. It was a safety valve, certainly, but also something deeper, a ritual questioning of society's very structure. This has disappeared almost completely from modern Christmas celebrations. Yes, there are gestures toward equality, charity for the poor, emphasis on treating everyone with kindness, but there's nothing that approaches the radical inversion that characterized Saturnalia. There's no moment when bosses serve their employees, when the rich submit to the poor, when power structures are genuinely, even temporarily, turned upside down. Why was this lost? Partly because Christianity, despite its message of spiritual equality, never fundamentally challenged earthly social hierarchies. The Church taught that all were equal in the eyes of God, but that didn't mean all should be equal in society. In fact, the Church often reinforced existing power structures, teaching that obedience to authority was a virtue. A celebration that questioned those structures, even ritually, was problematic. And as Christmas became more privatized, more focused on the nuclear family, there was less room for that kind of communal social inversion. Within a family, you might have playful role reversals, children in charge for a day. But that's not the same as a genuine inversion of broader social hierarchies. Modern Christmas doesn't question society's structure. It largely reinforces it, with its emphasis on consumption, the traditional nuclear family, top-down charity, rather than horizontal solidarity. Have you ever wondered what a Christmas that genuinely challenged social hierarchies would look like? Where, for a day, CEOs served their workers? Where politicians genuinely listened to those they govern? Where the rich experienced, even briefly, what it's like to live without privilege? It would be uncomfortable, certainly, but it could also be transformative, a reminder that the structures we consider natural and inevitable are, in fact, choices we make and could make differently. Another significant loss, the communal dimension of celebrations. Norse Yule, medieval Christmas, even early modern celebrations were fundamentally communal events. Entire villages participated. There were public feasts, not just private ones. People went from house to house, singing and being welcomed. There was an expectation of hospitality, that you would open your home, share your food and drink, receive not just friends and family, but strangers and travelers. This communal dimension has largely been replaced by private and family celebrations. And while there's great value in intimate family gatherings, something was lost in the transition. The broader community, the bonds that connect you to people beyond your immediate family, those have been weakened. Modern Christmas can actually reinforce isolation. If you don't have family, or if your family is distant or dysfunctional, Christmas can be a time of profound loneliness. There are attempts to recreate some communal dimension, community Christmas dinners for those alone, neighborhood events, public celebrations, but these often feel like add-ons, not the core of the celebration. The core is private, family-oriented, domestic. And for those who don't fit that mold, Christmas can be exclusionary rather than inclusive. Think also about what was lost in terms of connection to nature and the seasons. Yule was fundamentally about the winter solstice, about the turning point when light begins to return. It was about being attuned to natural cycles, about understanding your place in the larger rhythm of the year. The Yule log, the evergreens, all of that was about recognizing and honoring the natural world even, especially in its harshest and darkest moment. Modern Christmas retains some of those symbols, trees, evergreen wreaths, but often without any real connection to their original meaning. How many people who put up Christmas trees in their homes think about what those trees represent? How many consider the tree as a symbol of life persisting through winter, of hope for renewal? For most, it's just a decoration, a tradition followed out of habit without much thought about why. And for many people, especially those in urban environments, there's little connection to the seasons. We live in climate-controlled spaces. We buy the same foods year-round, shipped from around the world. We work the same hours regardless of how long the sun is above the horizon. The winter solstice passes unnoticed except as a curiosity, not as a significant moment in the annual cycle. There's something lost in that, a disconnection from the physical reality of our existence, from the natural cycles that shaped human life for millennia. And that disconnection has consequences. It contributes to the environmental crisis, to a sense of alienation, to a loss of context and perspective. Ancient winter celebrations kept people connected to those larger realities. Modern Christmas, for the most part, does not. Consider also what was lost in terms of duration. Saturnalia lasted a week. Yule lasted 12 days. Medieval Christmas extended through the 12 days of Christmas to Epiphany. There was time for the celebration to unfold, for different aspects to be explored, for the normal rhythm of life to be genuinely suspended for a significant period. Modern Christmas, for most people, is essentially one day, maybe two, if you include Christmas Eve. Yes, there's a Christmas season that stretches for weeks or even months, but that's mostly about shopping and preparation, not actual celebration. The actual day is often frantic, rushing between different family homes, trying to fit everything in, exhausted by the end. And then it's over and you go back to work, back to normal life. There's something unsatisfying about that. The preparation is long and stressful. The actual celebration is brief and often exhausting. And then there's a kind of post-Christmas void. Many people report feeling depressed after Christmas, a sense of anticlimax. Perhaps that's partly because the celebration is so compressed, so intense, that it can't really meet all the expectations and needs built up during the long preparation. The longer celebrations of earlier eras allowed a different rhythm. There was time for different kinds of activities, parties, but also reflection, social gatherings, but also quiet moments, excess, but also recovery. The celebration could breathe, could unfold naturally instead of being crammed into a single, frantic day. There's also the loss of certain kinds of joy and spontaneity. Descriptions of medieval Christmas celebrations speak of a wild, uninhibited quality: dancing, music, games, pranks. There was the Lord of Misrule, there were theatrical performances, there was a carnivalesque quality where normal rules were suspended and almost anything was allowed. Modern Christmas is much more restrained, more controlled. There's an emphasis on everything being perfect. The perfect decoration, the perfect meal, the perfect gifts. There's less room for spontaneity, for mess, for the kind of chaotic joy that characterized older celebrations. Everything is planned, choreographed, often documented for social media. Spontaneity has been replaced by performance, and there's the loss of certain kinds of religious and spiritual content. Now, it may seem strange to say this when Christmas is nominally a Christian holiday, but modern Christmas, even for many Christians, is much more secular than religious. The story of Jesus' birth may be told, but it's often marginal to the actual celebration. Santa is far more central than Jesus for most children. The commercial and consumerist aspects dominate the spiritual ones. But it's not just Christian content that's been lost or marginalized. It's also the older pagan spiritual elements, the sense of mystery, of connection to forces larger than ourselves, of participating in cycles that transcend individual life. Ancient celebrations had a numinous quality, a sense that you were touching something sacred, something beyond the ordinary. Modern Christmas may have moments of transcendence, a deep connection with family, the beauty of a carol, a moment of genuine generosity. But it's often buried under commercialization, stress, performance. The sacred, whether defined in Christian, pagan, or simply as moments of deep meaning, struggles to find space. There's also specific traditions that were lost and worth noting. Wassailing, for example, an English tradition of going house to house, singing and sharing a special hot-spiced apple drink, or the tradition of making offerings to orchard trees to ensure a good harvest the next year, or the elaborate theatrical performances of biblical and folk stories that were central to medieval celebrations, or divination traditions, trying to predict the future through various rituals performed on Christmas Eve. Some of these traditions may seem superstitious or irrelevant to us now, but they served important purposes, creating community connection, providing structure and meaning, connecting people to natural and agricultural cycles, offering ways to cope with uncertainty about the future. When those traditions were lost, something was lost with them. And there's the question of whose voices and perspectives were marginalized or silenced in the story we tell about Christmas. The dominant narrative is largely European Christian middle class, but there were and are many other ways to mark this time of year, many other traditions that were suppressed or ignored. Indigenous traditions, African traditions, Asian traditions, all had their own ways of marking the winter solstice or year-end. When Christmas became dominant, those other traditions were often actively suppressed. Christian missionaries around the world worked to eliminate local celebrations and replace them with Christmas. Colonizers imposed their traditions on colonized peoples, and the result is a loss of cultural diversity, a homogenization that impoverishes us all. Today, there are efforts to recover some of those lost traditions, to recognize and honor different ways of marking this time of year. Kwanzaa, for example, was created in the 1960s as an African-American celebration honoring African heritage and culture. There are attempts to revive ancient pagan solstice celebrations. There's growing recognition that Christmas shouldn't be the only way to celebrate in December. But these efforts struggle against centuries of Christmas dominance, against the enormous cultural and commercial machine that promotes Christmas as the universal celebration. It's hard to create space for alternatives when Christmas is everywhere, in every store, every media outlet, every public space. Diversity is possible in theory, but difficult to realize in practice. So what do we do with these losses? Can or should we try to recover some of the lost elements? There are movements in that direction, people trying to create more communal, more nature-connected, more spiritual, less commercial celebrations. There are attempts to slow down, to extend the celebration, to create space for genuine spontaneity and joy. There are efforts to recognize and honor diverse traditions, but there's also the question of whether you can really recover what's lost. The social, economic, and cultural conditions that gave rise to ancient celebrations no longer exist. We can't go back to pre-industrial agrarian societies. We can't undo centuries of change, and perhaps we shouldn't want to. There was much in ancient societies that was harsh, unjust, limiting. But perhaps we can learn from what's lost. We can recognize that our current celebrations, no matter how established they seem, are just one possible form among many. We can question which needs they fulfill and which they leave unmet. We can experiment, adapt, create new traditions that incorporate the best of the old and the new. We can make conscious choices about how we celebrate, rather than just following what commercial culture tells us to do. But to do that effectively, we first need to understand more deeply how we got where we are, how historical forces shaped our current celebrations in ways we often don't recognize. What larger patterns can we see when we look at the entire history of Christmas with fresh eyes? When you step back and look at the entire history of winter celebrations, from Yule bonfires in Nordic forests to twinkling LED lights in modern suburban homes, certain patterns emerge. Patterns that repeat across cultures and eras, revealing something fundamental about how societies function and how humans create meaning. Recognizing these patterns helps us understand not just the past, but also the present, and perhaps even imagine different futures. The first pattern is one of absorption and transformation. Repeatedly, we see new traditions not completely replacing the old ones, but absorbing them, transforming them, giving them new meanings while retaining old forms. Christianity didn't eliminate Saturnalia and Yule. It absorbed them, reinterpreted their symbols, gave them new theological meanings while allowing many practices to continue. The Victorian era didn't create Christmas from scratch. It took existing elements and reorganized them into new configurations. This pattern reveals something important about how cultural change really works. It's rarely revolutionary, a complete break with the past. More often, it's evolutionary, a gradual renegotiation of meanings and practices. People cling to what's familiar, even as they embrace the new. And those seeking to introduce change are more successful when they work with the grain of existing culture rather than against it. You can see this pattern operating today. New technologies don't eliminate old tradition, they transform them. We still send Christmas greetings, but now electronically instead of on physical cards. We still gather with family, but sometimes through video calls instead of in person. We still decorate, but perhaps with digital projections instead of physical ornaments. The forms change, but the underlying impulses persist. The second pattern is the tension between the sacred and the profane, between the spiritual and the material. This tension runs through the entire history of winter celebrations. Saturnalia was nominally religious, dedicated to the god Saturn. But in practice, it was very much about physical pleasure, food, drink, fun. The Christian Christmas was intended as a spiritual celebration, but it always incorporated very material and bodily elements. The Puritans tried to purify Christmas of its material elements and found it so emptied that they banned it altogether. This tension has never been resolved and probably never will be. Humans are both spiritual and material creatures. We have physical needs and metaphysical yearnings. Any celebration that neglects one side or the other will feel incomplete. The challenge is to find a balance, and that balance shifts depending on cultural and historical context. In modern Christmas, the pendulum has swung decisively toward the material. Consumerism dominates in ways that would have been impossible in earlier eras simply because the level of material production didn't exist. But there are also reactions against it, movements for simpler, more spiritual Christmases, more focused on experiences than things. The tension continues, manifesting in new ways in each generation. The third pattern is the cycle of elaboration and simplification. Celebrations tend to become more elaborate over time. More traditions are added, more elements incorporated. Everything gets bigger and more complex. But then there are moments of simplification, sometimes forced by external circumstances like war or economic depression, sometimes chosen deliberately as a reaction against perceived excess. You can see this pattern in Christmas history. Medieval celebrations were elaborate, extending over 12 days with multiple elements. The Puritans simplified them radically to the point of elimination. The Victorian era elaborated them again, adding trees, cards, commercial gifts. The 20th century saw continued elaboration. More lights, more decorations, more gifts, longer shopping seasons. And now there are movements towards simplification again, Minimalist Christmases, experiential gifts instead of material ones, focus on quality over quantity. No state is permanent. Elaboration eventually leads to backlash, to the feeling that everything has become too much, too complicated, too stressful. Simplification eventually leads to the feeling that something is missing, that the celebration has lost its richness and depth. The oscillation continues, and where you are in the cycle depends on personal, cultural, and historical factors. The fourth pattern is the tension between inclusion and exclusion, between the universal and the particular. Every form of celebration defines who belongs and who doesn't. Saturnalia was for Romans, not barbarians. Yule was for specific Nordic communities. Christian Christmas was by definition for Christians. But simultaneously there are impulses toward inclusion, toward the idea that the celebration should be for everyone. This tension is particularly acute in modern Christmas. It's nominally a Christian holiday, but celebrated by many non-Christians. It's dominant in Western culture, but has spread globally. Is this inclusion, everyone welcome to participate, or exclusion, those who aren't Christian or Western, pressured to conform to a tradition that's not theirs? There's no simple answer, and the question is constantly contested. There's also exclusion within the communities that celebrate Christmas. The emphasis on family can exclude those without traditional families. Commercialization excludes those who can't afford it. Idealized depictions of perfect celebrations exclude those whose realities are more complicated. Every definition of how Christmas should be celebrated creates insiders and outsiders. The fifth pattern is the relationship between individual celebrations and broader social conditions. Celebrations never exist in a vacuum. They're shaped by and respond to economic, political, and social realities. Saturnalia reflected and temporarily suspended the rigid hierarchies of Roman society. Medieval Christmas reflected feudal structure. Victorian Christmas reflected industrialization and the rise of the middle class. Modern Christmas reflects consumer capitalism and globalization. This means that if we want to understand or change how we celebrate, we need to look beyond the celebrations themselves to the broader social structures. A less commercialized Christmas requires not just individual choices, but changes in the economic structures that drive consumerism. A more inclusive Christmas requires broader social changes toward equality and justice. Celebrations are as much symptoms as causes, but the relationship isn't one way. Celebrations can also influence broader social conditions. They can reinforce existing structures or question them. Saturnalia's social inversion, even temporary, kept alive the idea that hierarchies weren't natural or inevitable. Christmas's emphasis on generosity and compassion, even imperfectly realized, keeps those values alive. Celebrations are spaces where alternative values can be experienced, where different ways of being can be imagined. The sixth pattern is the importance of narrative. Every form of celebration comes with stories, origin myths, narratives about what the celebration means, stories that are told and retold. Saturnalia had its myths about Saturn and the Golden Age. Christian Christmas has the Nativity story. Modern Christmas has countless stories, from Dickens' A Christmas Carol to contemporary Christmas movies. These narratives are crucial because they shape how we understand and experience the celebrations. They tell us what we should feel, what we should value, how we should act. They create models and ideals, and they are constantly retold and reinterpreted, adapted to new contexts, used to convey new meanings. But narratives can also be limiting. When there's only one dominant story, the perfect family gathered around the perfect tree with perfect gifts, those whose lives don't match that narrative may feel inadequate or excluded. There's a need for multiple narratives, stories that reflect the diversity of real experiences, and there's a need for critical awareness of the narratives we absorb, of what values they promote and whose interests they serve. The seventh pattern is the role of memory and nostalgia. Celebrations are deeply tied to memory. We repeat traditions we learned in childhood. We feel nostalgia for how things used to be. There's a constant longing for an idealized past, a golden age when celebrations were supposedly more authentic, more meaningful, less corrupted. But this nostalgia is often misleading. The past wasn't as perfect as we remember or imagine. Every generation had its complaints about how celebrations had become too commercialized, too secular, too different from what they used to be. Victorians complained about commercialization. Medievals complained about the loss of ancient traditions. Nostalgia tells us more about our present anxieties than past realities. But memory and nostalgia also serve important purposes. They connect us to our past, create continuity through time, provide a sense of identity. The challenge is to honor the past without being imprisoned by it, to learn from history without idealizing it, to create traditions that honor memory while remaining open to change and adaptation. The eighth pattern is the interaction between the local and the global. Historically, celebrations were deeply local. Each region, each community had its own specific variations. But there's also always been forces toward standardization, toward creating shared forms that transcend specific localities. Christianity created a shared framework for celebrations across Europe, but within that framework there was enormous local variation. In the modern era, globalization has intensified this tension. There's a global Christmas culture, disseminated through media, advertising, international trade. But there's also resistance, efforts to maintain distinct local traditions, to adapt Christmas to specific cultural contexts. The result is a complex mix of homogeneity and diversity, where global and local elements coexist and interact. This raises questions about cultural identity and autonomy. How much of the homogenization is genuine choice and how much imposition? How do communities maintain their distinct traditions in the face of powerful global forces? How do we create space for diversity while also recognizing shared humanity? These aren't just questions about Christmas, they're about navigating globalization in general. The ninth pattern is the relationship between tradition and innovation. There's constant tension between preserving inherited traditions and creating new ones. Traditionalists argue that old ways are better, that we should keep what was passed to us. Innovators argue that traditions must evolve, that each generation should create its own forms of celebration. And most people in practice do a bit of both. Keep some traditions, modify others, create some new. What counts as traditional is, in itself, constantly changing. Many practices we now consider timeless Christmas traditions are actually quite recent. Christmas trees, cards, modern Santa, all only 1 or 2 centuries old. In 100 years, practices we're creating now will be considered ancient traditions. Tradition isn't static, it's a river, constantly flowing, always changing even as it maintains certain continuity. The 10th and perhaps most important pattern is the resilience and adaptability of human celebrations. Through wars, plagues, economic depressions, radical technological changes, massive social transformations, people kept celebrating. The forms changed, sometimes dramatically. The meanings evolved, but the need to mark time, to create moments of joy and connection, to affirm values and hopes that persisted. This resilience suggests that celebrations fulfill deep and fundamental human needs. They're not superfluous luxuries that disappear when times get tough. They're essential to how we make sense of our lives, how we create community, how we transmit values, how we sustain hope. And as long as those needs persist, celebrations will continue, adapting to whatever circumstances we find ourselves in. So, when we look at these patterns, absorption and transformation, tension between sacred and profane, cycles of elaboration and simplification, inclusion and exclusion, the relationship to social conditions, the power of narrative, the role of memory, the interaction between local and global, tradition and innovation, resilience and adaptability. What do we learn? Perhaps this: that celebrations are more complex, more dynamic, more deeply rooted in human experience than we generally recognize. They're not just superficial parties, they're expressions of who we are, what we value, how we understand our place in the world. And understanding their history helps us understand ourselves. But understanding isn't enough. The real question is, what do we do with that understanding? How do we use these insights to create celebrations that better meet our needs, that reflect our values, that help us build the kind of world we want to live in? If we understand the historical patterns, if we recognize what was lost and what remains, if we see the tensions and contradictions in modern celebrations, then a natural question arises: can we do better? Can we create celebrations that preserve the best of ancient traditions while responding to the realities and needs of the contemporary world? Can we reimagine Christmas, or winter celebrations more broadly, in ways that are more meaningful, more inclusive, more sustainable, more authentic? The answer, of course, is that this is already happening. Around the world, individuals, families, and communities are experimenting, adapting, creating new forms of celebration. There's no single coordinated movement, but thousands of small experiments, each trying to find better ways to mark this time of year. And from these experiments, certain themes and approaches emerge. One theme is intentional simplification. Many people are consciously rejecting the excessive consumerism that has come to dominate modern Christmas. They're setting limits on spending, focusing on meaningful gifts rather than numerous ones, choosing experiences over objects. There are movements like Buy Nothing Christmas that encourage people to buy nothing and instead give handmade gifts, services, or simply time and attention. This simplification isn't about deprivation, it's about intentionality. It's about making conscious choices rather than being swept along by the tide of consumerism. It's about asking what really matters, what truly brings joy and meaning, and then focusing on that, eliminating the rest. For many who make this shift, the result is a less stressful, less expensive, but more satisfying Christmas. But simplification faces real challenges. There are tremendous social pressures to conform to conventional expectations. Children see ads and want the toys they see. Families have expectations about what Christmas should look like. And there are genuine fears of disappointing people, of being seen as stingy or weird. Simplifying requires not just individual change, but negotiation with broader social networks. Another theme is reconnection with nature and the seasons. Some people are rediscovering the meaning of the winter solstice, marking it as a significant moment in itself, not just background for Christmas. They're creating rituals around the turning point of light, celebrating the sun's return, honoring the natural cycles that shaped ancestral celebrations. This may involve spending time outdoors, even in the cold, solstice walks, sunrise or sunset watching, lighting bonfires. It may involve bringing natural elements indoors, not just bought trees, but branches gathered on walks, decorations made from natural materials. It may involve cooking with seasonal and local ingredients, reconnecting food with place and season. This reconnection with nature responds to a real longing in many people who live increasingly disconnected lives from the natural world. It offers a way to ground celebrations in something deeper than consumerism, to reconnect with rhythms that are larger and older than any specific cultural tradition. And it has the added advantage of being more environmentally sustainable, less dependent on manufactured products, more attuned to ecological limits. A third theme is recreating communal dimensions. Recognizing that Christmas has perhaps become overly privatized and family-focused, some people are deliberately creating communal celebrations. Neighborhood dinners where everyone contributes a dish, community cookie decorating parties, group sing-alongs, service projects done together. These communal celebrations serve multiple purposes. They create connections beyond the nuclear family, building broader social networks. They include those who might be alone or isolated. They create shared memories and traditions that strengthen community. And they reclaim something of the public and shared character that ancient celebrations had, but which has largely been lost in modernity. But creating genuine community isn't easy in a world where many people are mobile, where neighborhoods are often collections of strangers rather than cohesive communities, where time is scarce and demands are many. It requires intentional effort, people willing to take initiative, overcoming the inertia and isolation that characterize much modern life. But where it happens, it can be deeply transformative. A fourth theme is intentional inclusivity. Recognizing that Christmas can be exclusionary, some people and communities are working to create celebrations that honor multiple traditions. Holiday celebrations that acknowledge Christmas but also Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, the winter solstice, and other December observances, public spaces decorated in ways that don't privilege one tradition over others, schools and workplaces that celebrate diversity rather than assuming uniformity. This requires sensitivity and skill. It's not about diluting all traditions into some generic, meaningless celebration. It's about creating space for multiple traditions to be honored in their specificities, while also finding points of connection and shared values. It's about recognizing that in a pluralistic society, no single tradition should completely dominate public space. But inclusivity also faces resistance. Some see any move away from Christmas dominance as an attack on tradition, as a war on Christmas. There are genuine debates about balancing majority rights with respect for minorities, about what belongs in public versus private space. These aren't easy issues, and different communities are finding different balances. A fifth theme is the recovery of spiritual or meaningful elements. For some, this means re-engaging with Christmas's religious content in deeper and more authentic ways, going beyond superficial observances to truly reflect on theological meanings. For others, it means exploring non-religious spiritual dimensions, moments of gratitude, reflection on values, contemplation of larger mysteries. This may involve creating new rituals or adapting old ones, lighting candles with specific intentions, moments of silence and reflection amid the bustle, readings of meaningful texts, whether religious, poetic, or philosophical, conversations about what really matters, about hopes and dreams, about how we want to live. The goal is to create space for depth amid celebrations that can easily become superficial. But finding authentic meaning is challenging in a world saturated with commercialism and cynicism. It requires vulnerability, willingness to go beyond surfaces, courage to ask hard questions, and it requires time and space, which modern celebrations often don't provide. Creating that space requires deliberate choices, often swimming against the cultural current. A sixth theme is environmental sustainability. With growing awareness of the climate crisis, many people are trying to celebrate in ways that minimize environmental impact. Reusable decorations instead of disposables, sustainable or second-hand gifts, local and organic foods, waste reduction, carbon offsetting for necessary travel. Some people are questioning specific traditions for environmental reasons. Real versus artificial Christmas trees, which is more sustainable, Christmas lights and their energy consumption, the environmental impact of products shipped around the world. These aren't questions with easy answers, but asking them is important in itself, bringing environmental consciousness to celebration decisions. Sustainability also connects to justice issues. Many Christmas products are manufactured in exploitative conditions in poor countries. Resource extraction for consumer goods has disproportionate impacts on marginalized communities. A truly ethical celebration needs to consider not just environmental impact, but also social and economic justice. This may mean choosing fair trade products, supporting local businesses, or reducing consumption overall. A seventh theme is personalization and creativity. Instead of simply accepting inherited traditions, many people are consciously creating their own family or personal traditions. They're choosing elements from different traditions that resonate with them, inventing new rituals, adapting old practices to new contexts. There's a handmade quality to it, crafting their celebrations by hand, so to speak, rather than buying them ready-made. This may involve making their own decorations, writing their own songs or stories, inventing their own games or activities. It may involve blending elements from different cultural heritages, creating hybrid celebrations that reflect multicultural identities. It may involve adapting traditions to specific circumstances, celebrations for non-traditional families, for those living alone, for those in unique situations. This personalization recognizes that there's no one right way to celebrate, that traditions are tools for creating meaning, not rigid rules to be followed. It empowers people to be active agents in their own celebrations rather than passive consumers of packaged traditions, and it results in celebrations that are genuinely meaningful because they reflect real values and circumstances. An eighth theme is conscious use of technology. Instead of simply letting technology shape celebrations in unexamined ways, some people are making deliberate choices about how and when to use it. Using video calls to connect with distant family, but also setting screen-free times to be fully present with those physically there. Sharing celebrations on social media, but in authentic rather than performative ways. Using technology to coordinate community efforts or share resources. There are also movements for digital detox during the holidays, turning off devices, disconnecting from social media, being fully present without screen mediation. This recognizes that while technology offers valuable connections, it can also distract from the presence and attention that make celebrations meaningful. The goal is to use technology intentionally as a tool, not to be used by it. A ninth theme is extending the celebration beyond a single day. Recognizing that cramming everything into December 25th is stressful and unsatisfying, some people are deliberately stretching their celebrations. Marking the solstice on December 21st, celebrating through the 12 days of Christmas to Epiphany, creating a genuine Advent, a period of preparation and anticipation that's meaningful in itself, not just a stressful countdown. This extension allows a different rhythm. There's time for different kinds of activities, preparation, but also reflection, social gatherings, but also quiet moments, excess, but also recovery. The celebration can breathe, can unfold naturally rather than being compressed into frantic intensity. And paradoxically, extending the celebration can actually reduce stress, spreading activities over a longer period. A 10th theme is integrating social action and justice into celebrations. Instead of separating celebration from concern for broader social issues, some people are deliberately weaving them together, using the Christmas season as a time to engage in justice work, serving in shelters, organizing for political change, supporting causes that reflect Christmas values like peace, justice, and compassion. This reflects an understanding that genuine celebration can't be separated from care for the world, that it's not enough to have private moments of joy while ignoring suffering and injustice around you, that the values Christmas is supposed to represent, love, generosity, peace, goodwill, must be lived in action, not just sentimentalized in songs and cards. All these themes, simplification, reconnection with nature, community, inclusivity, spiritual meaning, sustainability, personalization, conscious technology use, extended celebration, integration of social justice, represent attempts to create more authentic and meaningful celebrations. No single approach will work for everyone. Different people have different needs, values, and circumstances, but what all these efforts share is intentionality, the refusal to simply accept default celebrations, the commitment to make conscious choices about how to mark this time of year. And perhaps that's the most important thing, not the specific choices we make, but the fact that we're making choices, that we're thinking critically about traditions rather than following them blindly, that we're willing to experiment, adapt, create, that we're treating celebrations not as fixed products to be consumed, but as living practices to be shaped and reshaped. That's the true tradition, not rigid repetition, but creative adaptation. It's how celebrations have always evolved, and it's how they'll continue to evolve. But where will this evolution take us? What kind of winter celebrations can we imagine for the future, and how do we get there? When we try to imagine the future of winter celebrations, we face a fundamental challenge. The future is, by definition, uncertain. We can't predict with precision how society, technology, culture, or the environment will change in the coming decades and centuries, but we can identify trends, extrapolate possibilities, imagine alternative scenarios, and perhaps more importantly, we can think about what kind of future we want to create and how our celebrations can reflect and help realize those desired futures. One certainty is that change will continue. Winter celebrations won't remain static, just as they never have in the past. They'll keep evolving in response to new technologies, social changes, environmental challenges, cultural transformations. The question isn't whether there will be change, but what kind of change, in what direction, serving which values and interests. Consider the potential impact of emerging technologies. Virtual and augmented reality are already beginning to change how we experience the world, and this will inevitably affect celebrations. Imagine Christmas gatherings where geographically separated families can come together in shared virtual spaces, not just seeing each other on screens, but experiencing a sense of shared presence, where you can visit your grandmother's home on the other side of the world, see her decorations, sit at her virtual table, all without leaving your own house. This could be wonderful, overcoming barriers of distance, enabling connections that would otherwise be impossible. But it also raises questions. Would virtual presence replace or complement physical presence? Would we lose something important, touch, smell, the bodily materiality of gathering in favor of convenience? How do we ensure technology serves human connection rather than replacing it with simulacra? Or consider artificial intelligence. We already have AI assistants that can help plan celebrations, suggest gifts, even generate personalized Christmas cards. As AI becomes more sophisticated, it could take on more aspects of celebrations, planning perfect meals, creating customized decorations, even generating entire celebration experiences tailored to individual preferences. This could reduce the stress and labor of celebrations, but it could also remove the human element, the imperfection and spontaneity that make celebrations memorable. Climate change will inevitably shape future celebrations. As weather patterns shift, winter celebrations may need to adapt. In some regions, winters may become milder, changing the character of celebrations shaped by cold and darkness. In others, weather patterns may become more extreme and unpredictable, disrupting traditions that depend on specific conditions. There's also the issue of growing environmental consciousness. As more people recognize the urgency of the climate crisis, there may be increasing pressure for more sustainable celebrations. This could lead to significant changes, less emphasis on consumable products, more focus on experiences, fewer disposable decorations, more reusable or natural ones, less long-distance travel, more local celebrations, less waste, more awareness of resources, but there could also be resistance. Celebrations are emotionally charged, tied to identity and memory. Asking people to change how they celebrate may feel like an attack on something precious. Finding ways to make celebrations more sustainable while preserving what people value in them will be a significant challenge, but it's a challenge that will have to be faced if we want a habitable future. Demographic changes will also shape future celebrations. In many parts of the world, populations are aging with fewer children and more elderly. This could change the character of celebrations, which in the 20th century became so child-focused. Future celebrations may need to serve the needs and interests of older populations more. Or there may be a rediscovery of intergenerational forms of celebration that honor all ages. Migration and growing cultural diversity will continue to transform celebrations. As people move across borders, they bring their traditions with them, creating fascinating cultural hybrids. Future celebrations may become increasingly multicultural, blending elements from different traditions in creative ways. This could enrich celebrations, bringing new vitality and diversity. But it also requires careful navigation of issues like cultural appropriation, respect, and authenticity. The structure of families and relationships is changing, and celebrations will have to adapt. Traditional nuclear families are less the norm. There are more single-parent families, blended families, same-sex families, people living alone, chosen families rather than biological ones. Future celebrations will need to be inclusive of these diverse family structures, not assuming a single model of how families should be. There may also be changes in how we think about time and work. If movements for shorter work weeks, universal basic income, or other economic transformations succeed, people may have more free time. This could allow for longer, less rushed celebrations, a return to something more like the 12 days of Christmas, rather than the frantic intensity of a single day. Or conversely, if current trends of work intensification continue, celebrations may become even more compressed and stressful. There's also the possibility of increasing fragmentation. Instead of culturally dominant celebrations like Christmas, there may be a proliferation of different celebrations, each serving specific communities or subcultures. This could be liberating, more choice, more diversity, more space for people to create celebrations that truly resonate with their lives and values. But it could also be alienating, reducing shared experiences that create social cohesion. Or there could be movements toward new forms of universal celebration. Some imagine global winter solstice celebrations that transcend specific cultural traditions, focusing on our shared humanity and shared relationship with the planet. Celebrations that honor the science, the astronomical fact of the solstice, while also meeting human needs for ritual, connection, and meaning. Such universal celebrations could potentially unite people across cultural, religious, and national divides. But they also risk being generic and rootless, lacking the richness and specificity that come from deep cultural traditions. And there's always the question of who defines what's universal. Often, claims of universality mask specific cultural particularities, usually Western ones. Another possibility is the resurgence of older forms of celebration. There's growing interest in paganism, in indigenous traditions, in pre-Christian practices. Some people are trying to revive ancient celebrations like Yule in more authentic forms based on historical and archaeological research. Others are creating new paganisms inspired by ancient traditions but adapted to modern context. These movements represent a longing for connection to the past, for forms of celebration that feel more rooted, more connected to nature, less commercialized. But they also face challenges. How much can we really know about ancient practices? How do we avoid romanticizing or distorting the past? How do we create celebrations that are authentic to our own lives rather than imitations of lives we never lived? There's also the question of religion's role in future celebrations. In many parts of the world, especially the West, there's declining traditional religiosity. Fewer people identify as Christian, fewer attend church regularly. This raises questions about the future of Christmas as a Christian celebration. Will it continue to secularize, becoming a cultural holiday rather than religious? Or will there be a resurgence of interest in its religious aspects as a reaction against secularism and commercialism? Different communities will likely follow different paths. For some, Christmas will remain a deeply religious celebration. For others, purely secular. And for many, something in between, retaining some religious elements more out of tradition than deep theological conviction. The diversity of approaches will probably increase rather than decrease. But perhaps the most important question about future celebrations isn't about specific form. What technologies we'll use, which traditions will follow, how we'll balance old and new. The most important question is about values and purposes. What do we want our celebrations to accomplish? What needs should they fulfill? What kind of world should they help create? If we want celebrations that promote genuine connection, we need to resist the forces that isolate and atomize us. If we want celebrations that are environmentally sustainable, we need to challenge the consumerism that currently dominates them. If we want celebrations that are inclusive, we need to question assumptions about what's normal or traditional. If we want celebrations that are meaningful, we need to create space for depth amid cultural superficiality. And here's something crucial. The future of celebrations isn't something that simply happens to us. It's not determined by impersonal forces beyond our control. It's something we create through our choices, individual and collective. Every time we decide how to celebrate, we're shaping the future of celebrations. Every tradition we keep or abandon, every new practice we create, every value we prioritize or neglect, all of that contributes to the ongoing evolution of celebrations. This means we have responsibility and agency. We can choose to celebrate in ways that reflect our deepest values. We can experiment, adapt, create. We can learn from the past without being imprisoned by it. We can honor traditions while remaining open to change. We can make conscious choices rather than simply following what commercial culture tells us to do. And perhaps most importantly, we can make these choices together. Celebrations are fundamentally social. They create and express community. So reimagining celebrations isn't just an individual project, it's a collective one. It requires conversations, negotiations, shared experimentation. It requires willingness to listen to different perspectives, to find common ground while honoring differences. The celebrations of the future will be what we make them. They can be more meaningful or more empty, more connected or more isolated, more sustainable or more destructive, more inclusive or more exclusive. The choice is ours. And making that choice consciously, intentionally, in community with others, that in itself is a form of celebration. It's an affirmation that our lives matter, that our values matter, that we have the power to shape our own experiences and traditions. So perhaps the question isn't really, what will future celebrations be like? The real question is, what do we want them to be? And what are we willing to do to create that future? These are questions each of us must answer for ourselves, in dialogue with our communities, informed by history, but not limited by it. The answers will shape not just how we celebrate, but who we become. Because we are, in part, the stories we tell and the rituals we practice. Changing our celebrations is changing ourselves, and perhaps by doing so carefully and intentionally, we can become more like who we want to be. But before we look forward, it's worth pausing to reflect on this entire journey we've taken together, from ancient fires to future possibilities. What have we learned? What does it all mean? And how do we carry these insights with us as we continue our own journeys? We have reached the end of this journey through time, from the darkest nights of ancient Rome and the frozen forests of northern Europe to the complex and contradictory days of our present. We have traveled 2 millennia of human celebrations, observing how forms have changed dramatically, while certain fundamental needs have remained remarkably constant. And now, in this moment of pause and reflection, it's worth considering what all this history teaches us about ourselves, about our needs, about how we create meaning in our lives. The first lesson, perhaps, is about continuity. When you light a candle in December, when you decorate a tree, when you gather with the people you love to share a meal, You are participating in something that extends far beyond your individual life. You are connected to countless generations who came before, who did similar things for similar reasons. Romans lighting candles during Saturnalia, Nordics keeping their Yule fires burning, Victorians gathered around their decorated trees. All of them were responding to the same basic human needs that you are responding to now. There's something deeply comforting in this continuity. In a world that often feels like it's changing too fast, where uncertainty is constant and the future is hazy, celebrations connect us to something larger and more enduring than ourselves. They remind us that humanity has endured hard times before and survived, that people have always found ways to create joy and meaning even in the most challenging circumstances. This historical perspective can be a source of strength and hope. But the second lesson is about change. Yes, there is continuity, but there's nothing static or unchanging about celebrations. They are always evolving, always adapting to new circumstances. Saturnalia transformed into Christmas. Christmas was banned and then revived. It was reinvented by the Victorians. It was transformed by industrialization, world wars, globalization, digital technology. And it will continue to change because that's what living traditions do. They change. This change isn't betrayal of tradition. It's the very essence of tradition. A tradition that can't adapt, that insists on remaining exactly the same, regardless of circumstances, isn't a living tradition. It's a museum piece, a fossilized relic. The most enduring traditions are those flexible enough to adapt while maintaining some core of continuity. And Christmas, in all its varied forms, has demonstrated this remarkable flexibility for 2 millennia. This means you don't have to feel bound by the traditions you inherited. You have permission to adapt them, to create new ones, to consciously choose how to celebrate in ways that make sense for your life, your values, your circumstances. You are participating in a tradition of adaptation, of creativity, of making celebrations your own. That's the true inheritance the past offers us, not a fixed set of practices to be mechanically repeated, but an invitation to participate in the ongoing process of creating meaning. The third lesson is about universal human needs. Through all the changes in forms, through all the cultural differences, certain needs remain constant. We need light in the darkness, literal and metaphorical. We need warmth, physical and emotional. We need connection with other human beings. We need moments of abundance and joy to balance the hardships of everyday life. We need rituals that give us structure and meaning. We need hope, especially in difficult times. These needs aren't specific to any culture or era. They are deeply human, rooted in our biology and psychology. And as long as these needs persist, which means as long as we are human, there will be celebrations of some kind to fulfill them. The specific forms will change, but the underlying functions will remain. Recognizing this helps us see beyond the surfaces, to understand what really matters in celebrations, and this frees us from arguing over superficial details. It doesn't really matter if you have a real or artificial tree, if you give gifts on December 25th or January 6th, if you call it Christmas or winter solstice or simply the holidays. What matters is whether your celebration meets real needs, for connection, for meaning, for joy, for hope. If it does, then it's fulfilling its purpose, regardless of its specific form. The fourth lesson is about power and choice. The history of winter celebrations is, in part, a history of power. Who has the power to define how people celebrate, which traditions are promoted and which suppressed? Who benefits from different forms of celebration? The Christian Church used its power to absorb and transform pagan celebrations. The Puritans used political power to ban Christmas. The Victorians used cultural power to reinvent it. Modern corporations use economic power to shape it in increasingly commercial directions. But history also shows that ordinary people aren't simply passive recipients of these top-down impositions. They resist, adapt, create their own traditions despite official pressures. Common Romans continued their Saturnalia celebrations even when the Church disapproved. English people resisted the Puritan ban on Christmas. People today are finding ways to celebrate that resist excessive consumerism. There's agency, there's choice, there's bottom-up power, as well as top-down. Recognizing this is empowering. You aren't powerless in the face of cultural and commercial forces that shape celebrations. You have choices. You can consciously decide how to celebrate, resist pressures that don't align with your values, create traditions that are genuinely meaningful to you. Yes, there are limits. You can't change the whole culture alone. But within your own life, your own family, your own community, you have more power than you might realize. The fifth lesson is about loss and recovery. Throughout history, much has been lost. Traditions that disappeared, meanings that were forgotten, practices that were suppressed. And it's important to recognize and mourn those losses. They represent possibilities that weren't realized, ways of being and celebrating that could have enriched our lives. The radical social inversion of Saturnalia, the extended communal celebrations of medieval Christmas, the deep connection to nature and seasons of Yule. All these elements have largely been lost, and we are poorer for it. But history also shows that what was lost can sometimes be recovered, though never exactly in the same form. Elements of ancient celebrations resurface in new contexts. People rediscovering the meaning of the solstice. Communities recreating communal dimensions of celebration. Individuals reconnecting with nature. We can't go back to the past, but we can learn from it, recover elements that were lost, and adapt them to our present circumstances. The sixth lesson is about diversity and pluralism. There's no one right way to celebrate. There never has been. Even when Christmas was culturally dominant, there was enormous variation in how different people, different communities, different cultures celebrated it. And as our societies become more diverse, more multicultural, more pluralistic, that diversity will only increase. This is something to celebrate, not lament. The diversity of celebrations reflects the diversity of human experience. It offers more options, more possibilities, more ways to find meaning. Yes, it can be challenging. It requires us to learn to live with differences, to create space for multiple traditions, not to assume everyone celebrates the same way. But the result is a richer, more vibrant, more inclusive culture. The seventh lesson is about the balance between tradition and innovation. We don't have to choose between honoring the past and creating the future. The best celebrations do both. They maintain connections to inherited traditions while remaining open to adaptation and innovation. They respect what came before without being imprisoned by it. They create space for both continuity and change. Finding this balance isn't always easy. There are real tensions between traditionalists who want to preserve what's inherited and innovators who want to create something new. But these tensions can be productive if approached with respect and openness. Conversations about how to celebrate, about which traditions to keep and which to change, can be valuable in themselves. They force us to articulate our values, listen to different perspectives, negotiate differences. The eighth lesson is about the relationship between celebrations and everyday life. Celebrations don't exist in isolation. They're shaped by and reflect the realities of everyday life, economic structures, social relationships, technologies, cultural values. And they also influence everyday life, offering moments of pause and reflection, creating spaces where alternative values can be experienced, keeping alive possibilities that normal life may not allow. This means that if we want to change our celebrations, we often need to change broader aspects of how we live. A less commercialized Christmas requires challenging economic structures that promote consumerism. A more communal Christmas requires building stronger communities in everyday life. A more sustainable Christmas requires broader changes toward environmental sustainability. Celebrations are both symptoms and possible catalysts for wider social change. The ninth lesson is about meaning and authenticity. In a world that often feels superficial and commercialized, there's a deep longing for authentic meaning. People want celebrations that are genuinely meaningful, not empty performances or stressful obligations. They want real connections, not superficial interactions. They want moments of depth, not just shiny surfaces. Creating this kind of authentic meaning requires intentionality and courage. It requires willingness to go beyond surfaces, to ask hard questions, to be vulnerable. It requires creating space for silence and reflection amid the bustle. It requires making conscious choices about what really matters and then aligning actions with those values. It's not easy, but it's possible. And when it happens, when you experience a celebration that's genuinely meaningful, you know it. There's a quality of presence, of connection, of fullness that can't be faked or bought. The 10th and final lesson is about hope. Through all the changes, through all the difficulties humanity has faced, wars, plagues, depressions, persecutions, displacements, people kept celebrating. They kept lighting lights in the darkness, kept gathering, kept creating moments of joy and connection. This persistence is itself a form of hope, a refusal to let darkness prevail, an affirmation that life is worth celebrating even when it's hard. And perhaps that's it, in the end, what winter celebrations have always really been about. Not about specific forms or particular traditions, but about hope. Hope that light will return after darkness. Hope that spring will follow winter. Hope that life will continue, that humanity will endure, that there are reasons for joy even in hard times. This hope isn't naive or unfounded. It's based on 2 millennia of evidence that humans are remarkably resilient, remarkably creative, remarkably able to find light even in the deepest darkness. So, as you continue your own journey, as you navigate your own celebrations, carry these lessons with you. Remember that you are part of something much larger and older than yourself. Remember that you have choices, that you have power to shape your own traditions. Remember that what really matters aren't the superficial forms, but the deep human needs that celebrations fulfill. Remember that change isn't betrayal, but the essence of living tradition. And remember, above all, to keep hope alive, to continue lighting lights in the darkness, to continue celebrating life in all its complexities and contradictions. The lost Christmas traditions, Saturnalia, Yule, aren't really lost. They live in every candle we light, in every tree we decorate, in every gift we give, in every gathering we hold. They live in the fundamental human needs we continue to meet, in the hopes we continue to hold, in the light we continue to create against the darkness. And they will live in the celebrations we create for the future, celebrations we can't fully imagine yet, but that will be, as always, expressions of our shared humanity, of our resilience, of our refusal to let darkness have the last word. The light persists. It always has, and as long as there are humans to kindle it, it always will. That's the true tradition, the only one that really matters. And you, by celebrating in your own way, in your own time, are keeping that tradition alive. You are part of this ongoing story, this unbroken chain of light and hope that stretches from ancient fires to the lights of the future. And that, more than any specific form or particular tradition, is something truly worth celebrating. Good night, and may your dreams be illuminated by the light that persists through all eras.